It was the summer of 1998 when a group of 5 friends, Mike, Sarah, Jason, Emily, and Tom, decided to go on a camping trip deep into Blackwood Forest, a place known for its dense woods and eerie silence. The forest was remote, far from any town, and was said to be haunted, but they didn't believe in such things. They were just looking forward to a weekend of hiking, campfires, and good times. After a long hike, they found a perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. As the sun set, they built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and shared ghost stories, laughing off the chills that ran down their spines. But as the night wore on, the mood shifted. The wind picked up, and the fire began to flicker, casting long, dancing shadows among the trees. Suddenly they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like branches scraping against each other. But the trees were too far apart for that. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if something or someone was circling their camp. Sarah was the first to notice a pair of glowing eyes peering at them from the darkness just beyond the fire's reach. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The others turned to look, but the eyes vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. "Probably just a deer," Tom said, trying to sound brave. But deep down, they all felt the same creeping dread. They decided to turn in for the night, hoping that sleep would come quickly and chase away their fears. Hours passed, and the forest grew colder. The fire had died down to embers, and a thick fog began to roll in, blanketing the campsite in an eerie mist. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and slow, like someone or something was walking around their tents. Mike, unable to ignore the noise, unzipped his tent and peered outside. He saw nothing, but the footsteps continued, circling closer and closer. "Everyone wake up," Mike hissed. "There's something out there." The others scrambled out of their tents, their flashlights scanning the foggy darkness. The footsteps stopped. They were met with an oppressive silence, broken only by their own heavy breathing. And then they saw them, figures emerging from the fog, tall and gaunt with eyes that glowed like embers. The creatures were humanoid but twisted, with long limbs and faces obscured by shadows. They stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. Panic set in. Jason grabbed a burning stick from the fire, waving it toward the figures. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice shaky. But the creatures didn't retreat. Instead, they stepped forward, their eyes burning brighter, revealing mouths full of sharp, jagged teeth. They moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them and the group. In a frenzy, the friends grabbed whatever they could use as weapons, sticks, rocks, anything. They formed a tight circle, backs against each other, as the creatures lunged. Mike swung a branch at one, but it passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke, though he could still feel the cold, clammy touch of its skin. "They're not real!" Emily screamed. "They can't be real!" But the creatures were all too real. One slashed at Tom, leaving deep, bloody gashes across his arm. Another tried to grab Sarah, its long fingers wrapping around her wrist, pulling her toward the darkness. She fought back, kicking and screaming, until Jason managed to free her by smashing a rock against the creature's hand, which dissolved into mist. Desperation took hold. "The fire!" Mike yelled. "Get to the fire!" They stumbled toward the dying embers, throwing more wood onto it, hoping to reignite the flames. The creatures hesitated, their forms flickering like fading shadows. As the fire grew, they shrank back, their eyes dimming. Realizing that the light kept them at bay, the friends huddled around the fire, feeding it with anything they could find. The creatures circled them, unable to come closer, their forms growing fainter with each passing minute. But they didn't leave. They waited, their eyes watching hungrily from the shadows. Dawn was still hours away, and the group knew they couldn't keep the fire going forever. They needed a plan. Tom, clutching his wounded arm, suggested they make a break for it, run toward the river they had passed earlier, where the fog might be thinner. It was a risky plan, but they had no other choice. On the count of 3, they threw the last of the wood onto the fire, creating a burst of flames, and ran. The creatures shrieked, a sound that echoed through the forest, but the friends didn't look back. They ran through the woods, the fog clinging to them, the creatures close behind. The river was their only hope. They could hear the rushing water up ahead, but the creatures were gaining on them. One by one, they began to feel the icy grip of the creatures closing in, pulling at their clothes, their hair. But then, just as they thought they were done for, they burst through the last line of trees and into the open air by the river. The fog lifted, and the creatures halted at the tree line, unable to follow. They stood there, watching with burning eyes as the friends stumbled into the water, gasping for breath, terrified but alive. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the creatures slowly faded back into the forest, their glowing eyes the last to disappear. The friends didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, their hearts still pounding with fear. They never spoke of what happened in Blackwood Forest again. But the memory of those glowing eyes and the sound of footsteps in the fog would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And every time they passed the edge of a dark wood, they would remember the Watchers and the night they had to fight for their lives against the unknown. It was a crisp autumn weekend when 4 friends, Megan, Jake, Lisa, and Kevin, decided to go camping in the remote Pine Hollow woods. The forest was known for its beauty, especially in the fall when the leaves turned vibrant shades of red and orange. The group was excited for a break from their hectic city lives, looking forward to a few days of hiking, campfires, and stargazing. They arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon, the sun shining brightly overhead. The hike to their chosen campsite was peaceful, the only sounds being the rustling leaves and the occasional call of a bird. After about 2 hours, they found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a crystal-clear stream running nearby. As evening approached, they set up their tents, gathered wood for a fire, and started cooking dinner. The air was cool and crisp, and the fire crackled warmly as they ate and chatted about everything and nothing. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to more eerie topics, ghost stories, urban legends, and strange occurrences they'd heard about or experienced. They laughed off most of the tales, but there was an undercurrent of unease in the air. The woods were darker than they'd anticipated, the moon barely peeking through the dense canopy above. Around midnight, the fire began to die down, and the group decided it was time to get some sleep. They put out the fire and crawled into their tents, the sounds of the forest lulling them into a deep sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, Megan woke up. She wasn't sure what had disturbed her sleep, perhaps a dream, or maybe just the cold. As she lay there trying to drift back to sleep, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps slowly crunching the leaves outside their tents. At first, she thought it might be one of the others getting up to use the bathroom, but the footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. She held her breath, listening intently. The steps circled their camp, pausing occasionally, as if whoever was out there was watching them. Megan's heart raced, but she told herself it was just her imagination. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Morning came, and Megan mentioned the footsteps to the group. They shrugged it off, joking that maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. But as they packed up their gear and continued their hike, Megan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The day passed without incident, and they eventually found a new spot to set up camp for the night. This time, they chose a location farther from the trail, hoping for a more secluded experience. That night, after another evening of food and stories, they all settled into their tents, exhausted from the day's hike. But just like the night before, Megan woke up in the middle of the night. And again, she heard the footsteps. Only this time, they were closer. She could hear the leaves crunching just outside her tent, the sound so near she was sure she could reach out and touch whoever, or whatever, was there. Her pulse quickened, and she struggled to stay silent, afraid to draw attention. The footsteps stopped right next to her tent. She could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, as if someone was crouched right beside her. Megan squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the sounds to stop. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps began again, slowly moving away from her tent and back into the darkness. In the morning, she was the first to crawl out of her tent, her nerves frayed. The others followed shortly after, and Megan immediately told them what she had heard. This time, they didn't laugh. Kevin, who had taken the last watch, admitted that he'd thought he saw a shadowy figure at the edge of their camp just before dawn, but he had brushed it off as a trick of the light. The group decided to cut their trip short. The fun had drained from the adventure, replaced by a growing sense of dread. They packed up quickly and began the hike back to the trailhead, eager to leave the woods behind. But as they walked, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every so often, Megan would glance over her shoulder, sure that she'd see someone or something following them. But there was never anything there. The forest, usually so full of life, seemed unnaturally quiet, the only sound their hurried footsteps on the leaf-strewn path. As they neared the trailhead, they started to relax, the tension beginning to lift. That's when they found the first sign that they weren't alone. Just off the trail, partially hidden by fallen leaves, was a small makeshift camp, a crude shelter made of branches and a circle of stones where a fire had once burned. But what made their blood run cold were the items scattered around, pieces of clothing that looked eerily familiar, and a half-burned photograph of the group, taken just the day before. A wave of terror washed over them as they realized they had been followed the entire time. The stalker had been watching them, getting closer and closer, and none of them had ever seen him. Panic set in. They abandoned all attempts at stealth and broke into a run, racing down the trail as fast as they could. The image of the photograph burned into their minds. They reached the trailhead breathless and terrified, their hearts pounding in their chests. They piled into their car and sped away, not stopping until they were miles from the forest. None of them spoke about what happened in Pine Hollow Woods ever again. But the memory of that silent stalker, always just out of sight, haunted them for years to come. And every now and then, Megan would find herself glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see that shadowy figure watching her from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to step back into her life. Before the video ends, I would just like to leave a quick message for you all. I would firstly like to apologize for my slower uploads recently. I have been quite busy and have a lot to do. As for the upcoming week, I might not be able to upload at all for a bit due to my lack of time. But you have my word I'm not going anywhere. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. And finally, if you have any stories you would like to submit or see featured in a video, please see the description for the email. That's all. Enjoy.